were being executed, and people who were part of these different groups who were not attacking physically, sometimes politically were opposing, sometimes were accused of potentially violently opposing. These people were also purged and in some cases summarily executed. So what is the Leninist defense of that?
There's one thing to say. When Trotsky abandons, he basically gets exiled, right? He ends up in Mexico. What he does is he begins viciously attacking the Soviet Union. And Trotsky organized the Red Army for the basically to protect the Soviet Union from the counter-revolutionaries and the White Russians. And so he has pretty close ties to the generals at the time. And so one of the big fears is Bonapartism, right, where Napoleon Bonaparte comes in, this military leader, and kind of just co-opts the revolution and takes it his own way. And so one of the big fears Stalin has is, look, Trotsky's openly denouncing the Soviet Union and attacking us. He is pretty good and close to the generals, and so what we need to now do is purge the generals.
Well, and I understand purging the generals. I understand removing them from position. I don't understand executing.
Do you, Greg?
Here's the thing. I would recommend, this is a historical question, which, I mean, not to criticize, it goes a little far afield of what is to be done. The only answer that you're going to find is an answer in history. But just as sort of anecdotal evidence, I would look at Latin America, at what happens when civilian leaders imprison popular generals, and how often those generals stay in those prisons, and how often those generals leave those prisons and execute the civilian government and institute a military junta.
Or stay exiled, for that matter, if I can interject.
If you go.
Yeah, but, I mean, that's probably sort of simplifying, right? Because without support, the support that they received, they wouldn't have very much power. I mean, what I'm saying is someone else could have been used in place of, would you agree? That, okay, so the powers that wanted what they used, you know, the general, these coups for, they could have grabbed another malleable individual. Do you know what I'm saying?
So are you saying in Latin America, if these particular generals wouldn't have rebelled, some other general would have?
So if we take the example of Chile, and if it wasn't Pinochet, it would have been another.
Yeah.
Use the phrase puppet.
Well, I mean, Latin America is a bit different. Well, Chile specifically is a bit different.
Could we say that? What I'm saying is, could we say that if you, okay, so we kill General da-da-da, but the powers that be, that want what power, that General so-and-so is going to do, couldn't they just take another guy? You know what I'm saying?
Yes, you are absolutely right.
Right.
So what's the solution to that?
Purge
all the generals,
yeah.
which is exactly what happened. You'll notice, right?
There's a double standard in Leninism here, because Lenin is advocating what is to be done to take the hard route, to not assume that you can just do something violent and explosive and get it all done with and not have a risk or a problem, that you have to work hard to do things that are more difficult, challenging, and that require more persistence. Well, I see these purges, the violent purges more specifically, as being taking the easy way out in the hopes of simplifying matters and getting a spontaneous solution. I mean, you could get a better prison system, something in exile that's more actually confining and that prevents things like what happened in Latin America.
Do you want to give a response, Greg, and then take the next question?
I would say two things. One is this is something that often happens with the Soviet Union, so I'm going to issue this challenge to you. And then I'm going to give a response to the challenge. But it's very easy to say the purges in the Soviet Union. But of course, my question to you would be, what purges, when, and for what? And unless you can answer that, right, there's no rationalism in history. Right? There are no first principles in history on which we can unfold all of history in some rational fashion. You have various actors acting for various reasons at various times under various circumstances. So the real question needs to be what purges, when, and for why. And then second, under what instances, when you are faced with a giant military fascist threat, is purging your officer corps an easy way out? In fact, that seems like one of the most difficult things to do. The notion of facile, the facile notion that all violence is equivalent, I don't agree with. And in this case, the violence of blowing up a supermarket so people realize that Walmart is exploitative is of a fundamentally different character then radically restructuring, violently restructuring your entire military apparatus in order to confront threats both internal and external.
Well, and again, I can follow actually the Leninist thought pattern very closely up to a point. The violence, the need for violence to remove those generals, not the easiest way out in an ideal circumstance, but the concept of, the facade, it's tactically wise, and tactically wise it doesn't matter whether or not it's the easiest route. It's not easy to keep in people who you think might betray you, even if it's not fun to restructure. The easy way out is using violence to purge, rather than using a system to actually resolve things more fully, as opposed to just using violence and basically lowering yourself to violence.
I want to take the next question, and if we want to pick that conversation up, we can do that.
Well, I think we might be mistaken also too. You talk about, Rob, you talk about, restructuring this violent prison system or the violent nature of these purges. And I don't wonder if maybe we're mistaken. Right, we hear all these atrocious facts and accounts of, the purges and being sent to the gulag, but I would guess that I would venture that, taking into account the scale of what's taking place, if you look at the penal system in Russia during this time, I would say it's again, taking into account the scale of it, I would say I would venture that it's more civil than anything taking place in America at the time or elsewhere.
It's not like that time was free from atrocities everywhere. I mean, in America, we can assume that the capitalist state was, in any way benevolent. They were throwing together all the Asians in their little West Coast places. So. But I don't think comparison warrants justification or morality.
Okay, I guess really then to be more bold, I would say it was one of the most, perhaps the most civil penal system existing at that time.
Well, again, comparison and morality are two entirely different things. Saying that it's better than things that are shit doesn't mean anything.
You're right. You're right. I guess what I'm saying is, I would say you would have to show how it is immoral, or
No,
right.
And I need to do more research. I'm more questioning than trying to think.
I'm going to just make this final response and then kind of withdraw from this conversation for the sake of time. But this is I think where, no offense, where your lack of historical knowledge shows through quite brilliantly. Plenty of generals were killed. A significant amount of the general staff. By the way, 10 generals killed in a general staff is a huge amount of generals, right? So there were a significant number of generals killed. Also, there were a significant number of generals exiled to Siberia. Also, there were a significant number of generals and officers and army units that were put back into action, even though they had a questionable status in World War II, right? So when you say, well, it seems easier to keep these people around, and deal with them even though they had questionable loyalty, well, which people? There were some that was done for. There were some that were left in place. There were some that were just watched to make sure they didn't do. And then there were some that were executed. And the reasons why any particular general was exiled, executed, or left alone are historically contingent on that particular general. And so in order, I think, to have a fruitful discussion about it, you would need to bring up which particular generals and why their particular status was unjust or unfair. Does that make sense?
You previously recommended the Black Book of Communism for further research into that. Would that cover something like this, or is there another?
No. The Black Book of Communism is demographic porn.
Okay.
It's basically trying to add up the murders, even if it has to use somewhat sketchy statistics, up to, I think it's 100 million deaths. And so there are little individual stories, but what you really should look up is Histories of the Red Army.
Histories of the Red Army.
That's not the title of the book, but there are numerous titles of the book a title, or there are numerous books on the history of the Red Army, and most of those would be able to give you a better idea of what's going on.
Anyone you can recommend?
You know, I'll be honest, most of my knowledge from the Red Army either comes from primary sources, which are historically unreliable, or they come from World War II. There's a little bit done with the purges in World War II. Michael Glance's When Titans Clash, which is the best English language version of the Eastern Front. But more than that, I would highly recommend talking to Kat Brown. If she can't tell you, she can probably direct you somewhere where they could tell you.
She's in the history department here. So. Does anybody have any further questions? Anything else they'd like to bring up? There. Okay. There's no further questions. Thank you for your time.